Good morning, Professor Lee. Today we want to cover one of the most difficult subjects facing the global community, the problem with reducing greenhouse gases. Most people agree that the world does need to address the issue of climate change, but how we do this and which countries should do it is a problem that has been debated both in the media and between governments. So my first question this morning, Professor, is what is the historical situation with greenhouse gases? I mean, which countries have historically emitted the most?
That's a good question, because the historical situation is actually quite important. If we look at greenhouse gas emissions since 1950, in terms of historical emissions, industrialised countries have emitted roughly 80% of the carbon dioxide emissions. This is data from the World Resources Institute. This statistic is even more amazing when you consider that only about 20% of the world's population lives in industrialised countries.
Those are surprising statistics. I didn't realise the differences were quite so large, especially when you compare the populations. But what about now? Isn't the situation changing rapidly?
Yes, indeed it is. China has now surpassed the United States as the largest greenhouse gas emitter. In fact, it has far surpassed the US. In fact, according to data released recently from the US Energy Information Administration, carbon dioxide emissions from all developing countries will be 127% higher than in the current developed economies by 2040.
I guess that the terms we have been using, developed and developing and industrialised and non-industrialised, will no longer be accurate soon.
Quite right. These terms are fast becoming completely out of date for some countries as they rapidly increase their levels of industrialisation.
Okay, so let me summarise what I've understood so far. The industrialised countries are definitely those most responsible for past greenhouse gases. However, the pace of development in the less developed countries is so fast that soon they will be the major emitters by far. It seems to me that this means their per capita emissions will also increase, probably to a level much closer or equal to that of countries like the United States and Europe.
Yes, all of that is correct. But one thing you need to remember for now is that a significant percentage of the goods produced in developing countries today is actually exported to the developed countries. Some estimates say about a third of China's production, for example, is exported. This means that the industrialised countries are outsourcing their greenhouse gas production. The greenhouse gases are emitted in one place, but the consumption takes place in another place.
Oh, that's a very interesting point. So, where does that leave us in terms of responsibility for paying the costs of harm to the environment?
Well, it's actually quite complex. Researchers have proposed a few models to help us decide. For example, there is the idea that those who benefit most should pay, and there is another idea that those who have the ability to pay should pay. Taking these two principles into account, I have come to two conclusions.
And what are your conclusions?
Firstly, I think it is clear that the historical responsibility means that industrial countries should not only reduce their total emissions, but they should work hard at reducing per capita emissions. Historically, for a long time, it has been the developed countries who have benefited from industrialisation. So, the US and Europe need to replace coal energy sources with nuclear energy sources or renewable sources such as wind and solar power. They need to reduce their reliance on cars and thus petroleum, and also convert petrol-driven cars to electric cars. Now, this will all cost money. And also, there needs to be a lot of investment into renewable energy production. These costs need to be borne by the industrialised countries mostly. Of course, some of the actual research might be done in China or India or other countries, but the West should help by funding such research. For now, the most highly developed countries are those countries with the greatest ability to pay, so that is another argument. A final argument for this is the argument about outsourcing. When the industrialised countries are importing huge quantities of goods from the developing countries, they have to bear some of the responsibility.
What about individuals in these countries? Do they need to make changes too?
Absolutely. That's really another argument for the changes that need to be made. In the US and Europe, in all developed countries, there is room to move on per capita emissions. Individuals in these countries can do a lot to change their energy consumption. For example, did you know that very few Americans hang their washing outside? Instead, they use electric clothes dryers. Many houses in the United States do not even have windows that can be opened because the interior of houses are completely climate controlled with heating and air conditioning. I could go on and on. The average person in highly industrialised countries can reduce their own carbon emissions by doing a lot of simple things. Of course, there are changes that can be made around the world, in other countries too, but the real room to move is in industrialised countries.
Okay, so what's your second conclusion?
Right. Well, there is absolutely no point in only having industrialised countries reduce carbon emissions. In fact, if China, which is now a giant economy, does not also invest in renewable energies and reduction of carbon pollution, we will not succeed in keeping climate change at a reasonable level. So I believe that developing countries should gradually increase their reduction targets while still maintaining growth. But this can be done by investing in renewable energies and in nuclear energy. So, my position is that developing countries should bear most of the cost at the present time, but that developing countries must also set emission reduction targets.
Well, thanks for your time.
Just one more point. When a country reduces its carbon pollution and invests in clean energy, although it costs money, these measures actually really benefit the country and its population. Pollution decreases, so people get healthier, they live longer, have better lives. They also have better food sources. You know, fish are being badly affected by rising temperatures, so we can increase the amount of fish and other animals by simply reducing pollution. What I'm trying to say is that the benefits of addressing climate change are really wide-ranging. It'll make a big difference in our lives and to the lives of our children in particular if we can do this successfully.
Thank you. I feel that I understand the problem so much better now. Thanks so much for your time, Professor Lee.